Major offensive operations of the Ukrainian armed forces in Zaporizhia, Dnipro, Kherson, Antonivka Bridge, Donetsk region, and near Luhansk continue at full speed. Simultaneously, violent clashes occur in all these critical front lines. You know that the Ukrainians liberated the last free area in Zaporizhia and a total of 9 settlements in this region from the Russians. Then Kiev's offensive plans continued in the direction of Dnipro-Kherson. Ukrainian troops managed to sink Russian boats in this area and took control of the Antonivka Bridge in the Kherson direction. After all these offensive operations, Russia was stuck in Zaporizhia. But the attacks by the Ukrainians continued where they left off. While many war analysts and military experts debated which front line would be the next target of the Ukrainian armed forces, Kiev's offensive plan refocused on the Zaporizhia region. This time, the Ukrainians chose Berdiansk, one of the important port cities. Numerous explosions were heard in the city. Local residents have reported that they have not witnessed this many explosions before. Let's explore the breaking points of this critical offensive operation together. Recently, 11 powerful explosions occurred in Berdiansk. As a result, huge black clouds formed in the city's airspace. The targets of the attacks were military facilities controlled by the Russian army. The Southern Command of Ukraine announced that a successful attack by the defense forces on the morning of June 30, 2023, blew up the occupiers' headquarters and the fuel and lubricant depot on the outskirts of the temporarily occupied Berdiansk. This military base, which was used as the command center and operation area of the Russian army in the city of Berdiansk, was badly damaged after the attacks. Russian sources confirmed the striking attack. Russian authorities announced that the Ukrainian armed forces used Ick-made Storm Shadow missiles to attack military facilities. The range of these missiles makes it possible to hit the rear facilities of the Russian armed forces, including those in Berdiansk. Therefore, it is quite logical for the Ukrainians to use Storm Shadows in this attack. Because Storm Shadows, which are in the inventory of the Ukrainian army, can cover long-range distances. The attack resistance movement also shared critical evaluations of the attack on the main headquarters used by the Russians in Berdiansk. Agents of the attack resistance movement were the first to report that the attack on Berdiansk was effective. Another message released by the movement stated that the situation for the Russians was very, very bad. Russia thinks that after these attacks, the Ukrainians will no longer recognize borders, and these attacks will eventually reach Crimea within the scope of Kiev's offensive plans. If you've noticed, Ukrainians are trying to reach Crimea by targeting the coastal cities. Therefore, it is quite normal to have southern front lines such as Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Melitopol, Tokmak, and Kherson in Kiev's offensive plans. The actions of Ukrainian partisans in Melitopol and Tokmak continue from where they left off. Partisan groups supporting Kiev, which gain strength from the successes of the Ukrainian armed forces in critical areas such as Zaporizhia and Dnipro, also strengthened their resistance actions on the Kherson side. We can say that Russian remnants are found in the city. The Kherson direction turned into hell for Russian troops as Ukrainian troops captured most of the supply routes from Dnipro and Zaporizhia, already with the destruction of some dams in Novokakhovka and Kherson. The trenches of the Russians in these areas were underwater. Now the Ukrainians, who have taken full control of Kherson with the big offensive plans of Kiev, do not allow the small Russian attack groups here to increase. On the Russian side, this advance by the Ukrainian army created an atmosphere of chaos and anxiety. In particular, the attack on the airbase controlled by the Russian troops in Berdiansk and the continuous advance of the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Dnipro areas pushed Moscow to retaliate. Russia continued to target Ukrainian cities with missile and drone strikes this week, killing 12 people on Tuesday, including 3 teenagers, in one of its deadliest attacks in recent months. At least 60 more were injured when a pizza restaurant was targeted in Kramatorsk, a city in the eastern Donetsk region that is under Ukrainian control but close to the Russian-occupied parts of the country. These attacks were strongly condemned by international sources because the Russians targeted innocent civilians. Ria Pizza was a popular venue that regularly hosted international journalists, volunteers, and Ukrainian soldiers. Taking a break from the nearby front, Zelensky announced that a Russian agent allegedly involved in the attack has been arrested and will be charged with treason. Since the beginning of June, several deadly missile and drone strikes have been carried out across the country, including in the capital, Kiev, Zaporizhia, and the southern port of Odessa. A residential area in Zelensky's hometown of Kryvyi Rih was also hit. But these Russian attacks never discouraged the Ukrainians, and Kiev's offensive operations continued to advance steadily. So the Ukrainian counteroffensive continues in the eastern Donetsk and southeastern Zaporizhia regions, and the Kiev authorities claim to have taken the strategic initiative near the city of Bakhmut. In addition, the consequences of the revolt of Russia's Wagner mercenaries and its possible consequences for President Vladimir Putin continue to be analyzed after this insurgency. Ukraine continued its counteroffensive operations, and the Kiev administration reports that its forces advanced about 2 kilometers along the Stavka line, southwest of Bakhmut, and made gains. Ukrainian forces also continued to conduct offensive operations with the US-based Institute for War Studies and reported significant clashes in various areas along the front line. Following these statements, President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that it was a happy day for Ukraine, but Zelensky did not provide much detail on this or talk about any particular area. Ukrainian forces have also reportedly made gains in the southern Kherson region, crossing the Dnipro River and establishing a foothold on the left bank of the river, according to pro-Russian war bloggers. The latest possible advances came after the 24-hour mutiny of the Wagner mercenary group that ended 200 kilometers south of Moscow. This rebellion ended when Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko mediated between Yevgeny Prigozhin and Putin. But Ukrainian officials claimed that the countdown for Putin had begun after the Wagner rebellion in the Ukrainian capital. Attention was focused directly on the revolt of the Wagner Group, its leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, and its consequences for Putin and the course of the war in Ukraine. The drama on the Russian border reinforced the view in Kiev that Putin's term as Russian president is over. President Zelensky's closest advisor, Andriy Yermak, stated that Putin does not have much time left in power. At a briefing in Kiev, Andriy Yermak noted the year Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time, annexing the Crimean Peninsula. Then he explained that Ukraine has become obvious to the whole world, which they have seen since 2014. Yermak, as well as senior Ukrainian officials, all argue that President Putin would not be able to overcome a disastrous loss of authority. According to Kiev officials, the Wagner rebellion and Mr. Prigozhin's blaming the Kremlin's motives for war also stripped away what was left of Mr. Putin's chance to hold on. It is essential to remember that what Ukrainians, especially those who run the country, say about their Russian enemies, comes in the heat of a war that they rightly view as a struggle for national survival. The Ukrainians have waged a clever media war and are remarkably consistent in their messages to their own people, Western allies, and enemies in Moscow. For this reason, Kiev's assessments of the Wagner rebellion mirror the situation in Russia. Although the Wagner revolt is over, Vladimir Putin has undoubtedly faced the most serious challenge to his authority since he became president in 2000. Other senior officials in Kiev say they are convinced that there are unofficial but organized networks of disillusioned insiders against Mr. Putin. Alexei Danilov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, thinks there may be a new leader in Russia. Danilov reported that among them are security forces, officials, and representatives of Russian oligarchs who believe that Putin's decision to launch a full-blown invasion of Ukraine in February last year is both a personal disaster for them and a threat to Russia. After the last uprising in Russia, Alexei Danilov was among those who thought that Putin's term of power was over. When asked if he had evidence to support his analysis, Mr. Danilov, in his early 60s, wearing a military-style black suit with his surname inscribed on his chest badge, pointed directly to what was happening on the Russian border and in Belarus. Mikhailo Podolyak, another close advisor to President Zelensky, also agrees that there are several groups of people in Russia who want to take power. Podolyak claimed that Putin's top-down and authoritarian system has almost left a vacuum in the center of power. Another senior official, speaking on condition of anonymity, went even further, suggesting that President Putin would have to sack Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of Staff General Valery Gerasimov, perhaps in response to another military setback for Russia. The most important negative result of the Wagner rebellion in the short term was that it contributed to the successful progress of the offensive plan of the Ukrainian army. But Russian sources, Moscow officials, and other Kremlin supporter groups are currently highlighting the mistakes of the Russian administration by not focusing on the successful progress of the offensive operations by the Ukrainian army due to the vacuum created by Wagner. Yet perhaps the fundamental solution for Russian citizens is a change of regime. But if the offensive plans of the Ukrainians continue in this way, the Moscow regime will automatically change, because no country's citizens or opposition political officials can afford such failures. As the war between Russia and Ukraine intensifies, the Ukrainian army has launched Operation Moscow. The Ukrainian army carried out an air operation against the capital, Moscow, with long-range HIMARS missiles that it had placed in the city of Kharkiv, which it liberated from the occupation zone. The Russian government announced that the missile attack hit one of the largest ammunition depots in Moscow, and the Kremlin went on red alert, having suffered millions of dollars in losses. Putin openly threatened the Ukrainian leader, Zelensky. While the whole world waited for the war between Russia and Ukraine to end, it grew in intensity and spread to Moscow, the capital of Russia. In the early months of the war, the US government was saying that if it supplied long-range missiles to the Ukrainian army, Ukraine would use them to attack Moscow. And just as the US predicted, it happened for the first time in months. The Ukrainian army carried out an air operation against Moscow with long-range missiles. Before we get into the details of the news, let's give a brief overview of the success of operations inside Russia's borders. The Ukrainian army, which wanted to turn the Russian army's attacks on the Bakhmut front into an opportunity, started to organize operations against the Russian borders in a way that Russia never expected. The land operation organized by the pro-Ukrainian Russian Freedom Legend unit in the Russian city of Belgorod brought along many operations. The Ukrainian army, which gained great self-confidence with the capture of 3 different Russian towns in Belgorod, carried out an air operation with unmanned fighter jets in Moscow shortly afterwards. With this operation, which was organized in one of the border regions of Moscow, energy infrastructures and many buildings in Moscow were damaged. After this operation, Russian government officials stated that there were no casualties. Russian Defense Minister Shoigu, who stated that Zelensky was the person responsible for the operation, claimed that it was a retaliation. The Ukrainian government, on the other hand, sarcastically stated that they had nothing to do with this airstrike just a few days after this incident. The Ukrainian army decided to deploy long-range HIMARS missiles to the Chai region of Kharkiv, which it liberated from Russian occupation. At first it was thought that these missiles would be used for defense purposes. But as a result of the air operation organized by the Ukrainian army against Moscow, it was officially confirmed that the Ukrainian army launched a great offensive. An air operation was carried out with long-range HIMARS missiles placed in Chuhuv, Kharkiv, to a warehouse in the border regions of Moscow. Although it was thought that the attack failed when the missile sent by the Ukrainian army hit a warehouse, it was actually determined that this warehouse was one of the most important ammunition depots of the Russian army. The drones that have been seen in Moscow airspace for several days have been making the Russian government very uneasy. The Russian army, which destroyed 6 different drones in Moscow in just 2 weeks, could not determine who sent these drones, but they suspected Ukraine. Now it is accepted that these drones were sent by Ukraine. These drones, which were sent by the Ukrainian army to organize an air operation in Moscow, were detecting important centers of the Russian army in Moscow. So these drones were actually reconnaissance drones with the detection of one of the largest ammunition depots of the Russian army located on the Moscow city border. The Ukrainian army launched an operation and fired 2 HIMARS missiles at Moscow. The missiles, which were launched from the city of Kharkiv, made their way smoothly to Moscow airspace without getting caught by the air defense systems in Belgorod and successfully hit the Russian ammunition depot. The people of the region, who were surprised by the explosions, started to leave their neighborhood quickly when the ammunition in the warehouse exploded. The impact of the explosion became much greater, and the flames reached meters high in just a few minutes. Dozens of fire trucks, including Moscow fire brigades and fire brigades from neighboring cities, arrived to extinguish the burning warehouse. However, no one was allowed to approach the ammunition depot, which was blockaded by the army, suspecting that there might be unexploded munitions in the warehouse. Russian authorities prevented fire brigades from entering the warehouse. Instead, helicopters and firefighting planes were used to extinguish the fire. These successive airstrikes by the Ukrainian army drove Russian leader Vladimir Putin crazy, calling on Zelensky. Putin brought up the issue of nuclear weapons once again, stating that this attack will be repaid in kind. Putin clearly stated that they will not hesitate to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. With these words, Putin openly threatened Ukrainian leader Zelensky and stated that he should stay away from Russia. Russian leader Vladimir Putin panicked after the U.S. government sent long-range missiles to Ukraine. Before sending the missiles, the U.S. thought that the Ukrainian army would use them to launch airstrikes inside Russia's borders and the war would escalate. However, the Russian army crossed the borders after airstrikes on the capital, Kiev, and the Ukrainian city of Dnipro, damaging many energy infrastructure and buildings in the city. The Russian army also managed to exhaust the patience of the U.S. Thus, the Pentagon agreed to send long-range HIMARS missiles to the Ukrainian army. Shortly after receiving these missiles, Volodymyr Zelensky organized his first air operation in the Russian city of Belgorod on the border with Ukraine. However, this air operation actually contained a message. By targeting the energy infrastructure systems in the Russian city of Belgorod, Zelensky showed Putin that he could organize an operation inside Russia's borders if he wanted to. Putin, who was uneasy after this operation, decided to increase security measures in many regions with a sudden decision. The capital, Moscow, and the Crimean Peninsula were at the top of the list of regions where security measures were increased. Putin was started to place panzer air defense systems on the roofs of high-rise buildings, and government buildings in Moscow feared that Ukraine would attack Moscow. At the same time, Putin sent for more air defense systems to the Crimean Peninsula and installed 2 air defense systems only around the Kerch Bridge. As it is known, the Kerch Bridge has been blown up before and Putin fears that it will be blown up again. This bridge, which is the only road connection between Crimea and Russia, served as a gateway to Ukrainian territory. It is known that most of the ammunition and weapons sent to Russian troops in Ukraine are smuggled into Ukraine via the Crimean Peninsula. If the Kerch Bridge were blown up, Putin would be unable to organize these military shipments. These air defense systems deployed by Putin have caused the Russian people to become uneasy. The images of the air defense systems, which were a big agenda item on social media platforms, spread everywhere. The Russian government had to make a statement on the agenda of this event stating that there was no problem. They only decided to increase security measures. Russian Defense Minister Shoigu tried to calm the Russian people, but now it seems that Vladimir Putin has not increased security measures enough. The Ukrainian army was able to destroy one of the largest Russian ammunition depots in the capital, Moscow, very easily. But by not only conducting operations inside Russia's borders, but also by causing Putin millions of dollars in losses, Ukraine has greatly undermined Putin's authority. The Russian people are already beginning to think that Putin is unable to ensure Russia's security, fearing that there may be more attacks. Russian citizens want this war to end. Taking to the streets again in many cities, Russian citizens have already started protesting against Putin again.